is with us, and she's going to be helping us today. We have a few trust trainings today that we're going to be presenting. Starting out this hour, we're looking at establishing an affordable housing trust fund, looking at the example of Southampton. And at 1 p.m., we'll dig into getting started now that you have a trust. So some basics, as well as creating a mission statement, goals, and strategies. And then at 2 o'clock, we're going to be digging into supporting affordable housing development and how your trust can be engaged in supporting affordable housing. We are using the same link for all three sessions. We're just going to keep it open and take a break in between, and then start at the hour for each different topic. So we hope that you'll join us for each one. A couple things: if you would like subtitles to help you follow today, then you can just click the show captions button and that will offer you subtitles. And if you have questions throughout the different sessions, please put those in the chat. You can also message Emma directly and she can bring those questions forward. And we are taping this. These will all be on the Housing Toolbox, along with a variety of other trainings that you can refer to or that you can pass on to other people who missed today. So with that, I would like to welcome our guest, Sierra Simmons from Southampton. She is on their Housing Authority Board as well as their Community Preservation Committee. And she was instrumental in the planning committee that really helped establish an affordable housing trust in Southampton. So Sierra, welcome.
Thank you, Shelley. Hi, everyone. I'm Sierra. It's nice to see you all today. So I am from Southampton, which if you haven't heard of us, we are in the Pioneer Valley in Western Mass along the Route 91 corridor. We're a little south of Northampton. We are a rural town. We have a population of a little over 6,000 people. And I'm on the Housing Authority, and we have kind of a unique housing authority because we don't actually manage any properties, but we just have this goal of increasing affordable housing in our town. Just thinking of strategies, working on our housing production plan and doing everything we can to increase the number of units, because as you may be familiar with, the threshold that's recommended is 10% affordable housing units in your town, and we are only at about 2% in Southampton. And so one of the things that sort of prompted our need for a housing trust was, number one, our, like I mentioned, the lack of affordable housing units in general. And number two, so we have a community preservation committee in town. We have Community Preservation Act funds. And the housing portion of our community preservation funds was just building up and building up and building up. And we hadn't been able to spend it because every time a house would come onto the market or a property or something we might be able to purchase to develop for affordable housing, we would, in order to make that purchase and get the CPA funds, we'd have to go to the Community Preservation Committee, and then we'd have to go to town meeting. And by the time that happened, someone else, some private entity, had already bought up the property. So it was really our main driver for this was we wanted to be able to be sort of more nimble and act with the money that we had to be able to actually make affordable housing units happen in our town, rather than just having the money sort of stagnating there. And so the Community Preservation Committee was certainly part of this process. They were highly supportive. But there were a number of different sort of steps that it took to get through this process. So as a housing authority, we identified the need. We realized this is important. And really the first step is just to do your research. What I found really helpful was MHP's Municipal Affordable Housing Trust Guidebook. It's 40 pages, and it really outlines everything you could ever possibly need to know. And because if you are sort of the entity that's going to drive this forward, you really need to be well versed in all of the things someone might ask you so that you can answer questions and sort of assuage any concerns. So another thing that you can do is sort of look to towns that are sort of similar to yours, towns or cities that may already have a housing trust, and look at what they're doing. Generally, if you just go straight to Google and research the housing trust of any particular town, they'll have things on their website about what kind of projects they were doing, how the board is made up, and all sorts of details. So you can sort of see and compare. And MHP, again, was a really good resource for letting us know which towns to look into, which was hard for Southampton because there's not as many rural housing trusts to compare to. A lot of them are cities like, I think Acton was a big one, which, the population, the financials, everything is the space, the available, areas to build housing is all very, very different than here. So now it's unusual that a housing trust would, a housing authority would be the entity to sort of make this happen. Generally, it's considered a select board job, and I guess in a city, it would be, the city council's job to put that together. Correct me if I'm wrong, Shelley. But in our town, we have a select board, we have open town meeting, and so we knew we had to get sort of buy-in from any number of people, that anyone can show up at town meeting and voice their concerns. So we knew we had to really get buy-in across the entire community. But because we're a small town and we're largely volunteer government, and most of the people on our select board, in our various committees, they're really busy and they're on a lot of different committees and they have a lot of priorities. And so while we had been thinking about a housing trust for probably up to like a year or so, we haven't really made any moves on it. And so what I would just stress is that the entity that needs to drive the housing trust project forward is an entity that cares enough and has time. It doesn't really matter who you are. Someone just needs to set the time and make it happen. And you can bring it through all the right channels. You can, send it through select board or whoever is in charge and has to actually, make that decision. But whoever has the time and the care to make it actually happen, that's kind of who needs to do it. And so,
Sierra, just quickly, you mentioned that Southampton is small. How small?
Well, we have 6,000 people. Our area, I don't have our area off the top of my head, but
And
what other
place you in the state? Where are you in the state?
So we are in Western Massachusetts, not quite to the Berkshires, but sort of between Worcester and the Berkshires. Very small, very rural, lots of trees. And we don't have a whole lot of money in town, to make things happen. For example, while we have a CPA, if you have Community Preservation Act funds in a town where people have really high incomes and are purchasing really expensive houses, your CPA funds are going to be really high. Whereas in Southampton, not so much.
Thanks.
Does that kind of answer the question? So like I said, because our housing authority doesn't manage property, we had the time, we cared, and we were committed to doing it. And so we were the ones that had to sort of make it happen. And so one really key aspect to making this work was setting a timeline and setting ongoing meetings to actually get it on the calendar, make sure people are still checking in, coming back to it, and doing it. And so being part of MHP's technical assistance program was really essential for that, because they sort of helped us figure out what our timeline should be reasonably and checked in with us. And even though it's really on you, the town, to do the work, having someone just encourage you and say, okay, you're on track, keep doing this, here's your next step, and just holding us to those regular meetings was really helpful. And so in the absence of that, I would say just schedule those meetings on the books, make sure you're checking in regularly with the right people, and so you're consistently moving it forward. And so once you have that set up, really the first step is to get buy-in from the people who make decisions in town. So in our case, it was the Community Preservation Committee, the Planning Board, the Select Board, and the Finance Committee. And to do that, you really just have to, you know, reach out to them individually, reach out to the chair of the committee, either get on their
Uh-oh, did we lose Sierra?
Yes, I think we did.
reservation. Okay, ready to continue?
Go ahead, yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. So you get yourself on the agenda for these committee meetings, you contact the chair, you contact your friend on that board, whatever it takes to get an audience with that board, you get it. And we also had MHP, shout out again, gave their Housing Trust 101 presentation to our select board, which is really great. Sort of lets people know what the possibilities are, how other towns have done it, and sort of what it takes to get it done. And also just reiterating your own town's sort of rationale for why you need it to happen. So in our case, it was all this money is sitting in our housing account and CPA. We can't move on these properties. Properties are coming up for sale that would be great for affordable housing. We're not able to move on them. Another really strong selling point in our town was the fact that you can use your housing trust funds to pay for a housing trust administrator. So a lot of people's fear was like, oh no, this is more work for our overworked like town administrator or whoever it is. But once you have the trust established, you can actually use its funds to have a paid administrator. So that was I had to keep bringing up that selling point. People loved that.
Sarah, actually, before we get further, because of the interruption, could you repeat the key boards that you were reaching out to?
Yes, so in our town, it was the Community Preservation Committee, the Planning Board, the Select Board, and the Finance Committee. And you know, in your town it may be different, but honestly, whoever is sort of in the local government and cares, it's good to get them on your team because it's really sort of a team effort to get everyone to sort of know about it and be excited about it. Like I mentioned, we did have the Housing Trust 101, and we had the select board and some other boards come to it. And then we created an ad hoc committee to work on actually drafting the bylaw. And so that was 2 members of the Housing Authority. One of those members was also the select board liaison. There's actually 3 members of the Housing Authority. 2 of us who are just Housing Authority, myself who's also the Community Preservation liaison, and the select board liaison. And so we would meet with Shelley and Emma every month or 2. And the steps for drafting the bylaw itself. So generally your bylaw can be a lot like the state Affordable Housing Trust statute. You can easily find that on the website that has all the Mass General laws. And so you start with the state statute. And you can also, like I mentioned, look at other similar towns, as similar as you can get, and how they did their housing trust bylaw. And you can compare and contrast and see, okay, what did they add that wasn't in the state statute? How did they do it? And so Shelley's recommendation that we mostly leave it as is, because the more additional complications you add, the harder it is to get anything done. So, however, there are certain elements that you may want to change, like the number of members, how you select members, some of the way the processes work. You may have different legal processes in your town. So just sort of going through and making it as relevant to you as possible, get that draft done. And at that point, in our town, the next step is to take it to the bylaw committee. And so I met with the bylaw committee, and they also had a lot to say about, well, okay, you know, this one goes against this element of the law goes against this one town bylaw, that's not how we do things, etc. So they can sort of help you readjust the language. But I have to say, like, although one of the people in the committee did happen to be a lawyer, you do not need to be a lawyer to be able to draft this bylaw. Like, the language already exists. You're really just tailoring it to what you need for your town.
How long did you give the ad hoc committee, how much time did you give to actually write the bylaw, the draft bylaw?
I believe it was May through October. I could be
No,
wrong.
well, when you actually created the ad hoc committee, how fast? You guys actually gave a really tight deadline. It was like 3 weeks.
We really?
4
Wow.
weeks was very tight. So you forgot that part.
Yeah, so May to October was like the whole process. Actually writing the bylaw, I guess it was more like a month or a little bit less.
Yeah.
And in a way that's good because it sort of keeps you in gear, keeps you moving. And we also had the goal of if we had a special town meeting in the fall, which occasionally happens, we wanted to make sure the bylaw was ready before any possible special town meeting was scheduled. And so we really just wanted to make sure, even if the town meeting may not be until December, that we were ready by October because it could happen. We really wanted to move this through. So you're right, Shelley. It didn't take that long to actually write the bylaw. It was really just sort of the promotion stage after that that took kind of a bit. After the bylaw committee in our town, it has to go through legal. Everyone may have sort of different steps in their town, but that's how ours works. And then once it goes through legal to get on the town meeting warrant, it needs to be, someone needs to write the town meeting warrant. And then it gets sent to the select board. The select board votes to add it to the town meeting warrant, and then it goes to town meeting. So in the couple of months leading up to the town meeting, that was when we really needed to sort of go hard with community education and learning. As I mentioned, anyone can show up at the open town meeting, and someone who has never heard of a housing trust could decide that they hate the idea, they don't want affordable housing in town. You never know, things could devolve into a conversation about whether you need affordable housing at all, and bring people, okay, that's not necessarily what we're discussing right now. So things can get tangential, so just try to prepare yourself for any questions or concerns that may arise. So what we did was we had another Housing Trust 101 where all community members were invited. So we posted it in all the public forums where we post any kind of town public info session. So that was our website. We did Facebook. This was still semi-pandemic times, so we had it virtually. We could have had an in-person info session. We created, Shelley and Emma created a nice colorful flyer for us that we posted around town. We emailed everyone in town, emailed them, asked them to forward it to their friends, just like the general information sheet. So we had a flyer, and then we also had a little one-pager write-up that MHP helped with. That was sort of like frequently asked questions. Here's some examples of how housing trusts have worked in other towns, etc. And here it is up on the screen. And so that was really helpful. Just the frequently asked questions. Why do we need a trust? Here's some reasons. Just doing everything you can to give everyone the information that you can, and then go back and meet with all those same boards again. So now that you're at this process, at the point where it's going to town meeting, you go back, you say, okay, this is going to town meeting. I really just want to see if you have any concerns or questions, and just gather anyone. If people tell you they're against the housing trust at this point, that's great, because you want to get those questions asked and answered before the town meeting, so that in case someone asks that same question at the town meeting, you've already prepared an answer. So going to each of these meetings, these boards, back to the Community Preservation Committee, ask them if they have any concerns. Back to the Planning Board, ask them if they have any concerns. Back to the Select Board, back to the Finance Committee, make sure they're in support of it, because at our town meeting, if the Finance Committee is in support of it, that gives it a lot more pull. And so gather every question you could possibly get, and then work with your ad hoc committee or working group, whoever is pushing this forward. Keep meeting with them and have conversations about what types of concerns are showing up around town, what types of things you're hearing, and how you might respond to them if they were to come up in town meeting. And if there's any major concerns that come up, maybe you want to do another sort of publicity push about that particular concern. Depending on your particular situation, someone may bring up a really good point you hadn't thought of in your publications. Just make sure you're really addressing everything ahead of time, because ideally when you get to that town meeting or whatever the process is, you want it to be a slam dunk. And again, the fact that we had money just sitting in our housing trust account, at least in our town, people get concerned when they think about, in terms of voting for a bylaw, they get concerned when they think that that's going to take like new money and spend it on something. You know, are taxes going to be raised because of this? Like, where's this money coming from? So you really want to reiterate, at least in our case, that the money was coming from the Community Preservation Act funds that we already had. You can also get money from all sorts of different, you can have individual donors give money to your housing trust. You can have, I think so, some towns were doing like the cannabis dispensary taxes. They decided to put those in the housing trust. Oh, I see a question. How much was in the CPC fund? So in our town, it was about a little over $400,000 that was in our CPA housing account. To us, that's a lot. Some towns it might not be, but it had been building up for quite a few years. So it was just getting higher and higher. You can contact MHP for all of the different funding sources you can use to fund a housing trust. I don't have them all off the top of my head, but just have those ready so people know it's not coming out of their taxes. It's not going to cost them anything, the residents, anything to make this housing trust happen. That was really important for us. And then also in preparation for our town meeting, we reached out to the people we knew were in support of us, and we asked them to come and speak in support of the housing trust at the town meeting. So we had a real estate person who was in support of it. We had a member of the select board who was in support of it. We had members of community preservation who were in support of it. We had the historical preservation people were into it. People from all sorts of perspectives, whoever you can think of, even like maybe the most surprising people you might think of, maybe a developer, like a for-profit, anyone that can give sort of a different and holistic perspective of why it's important. Get those people to come and speak in favor of the project at your town meeting or whatever the avenue is that it gets passed. We had all our notes when we went to the town meeting. We had all our notes set up. We were so ready for any possible questions that anybody could have, any concern. We were ready to rebut whatever people said. And there was basically no opposition by the time we got there, which was really great. But I was still really glad that we had those like 10 pages of notes just in case there was any opposition, because you want to go in feeling confident and ready. But we had done so much work ahead of time, and that's really the goal, that by the time we got there, it just went through. We had already sort of addressed any concerns up front. People couldn't even ask the question, oh, is this coming from my tax money? Because we already made it really, really clear from the start that it was not. So once it got voted in town meeting, which was December, so just for the timeline reminder, we started with MHP in like April, I think it was. And so it was about a maybe 9-month period that it took for us to get this happening. That was once we started the technical assistance. In terms of when we had started like thinking about it and having the idea, that was more like 2 years. And so for us, the only step after town meeting is to get the bylaw approved by the Attorney General, and then to have the select board start appointing housing trustees. So any questions, things I can clarify, comments?
Well, to go on Cynthia's comment is, I think she also is getting at where there's CPA funds set aside for the trust at this point. Has that already happened or not yet?
That had not happened. So that's a great question. So when we met with the CPC, we did say, okay, so our plan is once we get this trust established, we would submit a request to the Community Preservation Committee to transfer those housing funds over to the housing trust. This is an allowable use for CPA housing funds. And I'm really glad you brought that up, because there was, one member of the CPC was concerned, well, how are we going to have control over what you're spending it on? What about the reporting? Well, the housing trust has to give a report to the CPC every year. And so there is very much reporting, there's very much oversight. Everything that anybody could be concerned about, it has to be used for affordable housing. It's an affordable housing trust, and by nature, that aligns it with Community Preservation Act housing funds. And the fact that there is like annual reporting back, that was really comforting to them. And so while we couldn't actually transfer the funds until the housing trust existed, we let them know that we were planning on requesting the funds once it was established, and just to sort of gauge their support. And so what I did is I was like, we'd probably start asking for maybe 100,000, 200,000. We don't need to move all the money out of housing. And the CPA chair at the time was like, oh no, we want to give you all the housing money. So they're actually even more supportive than I thought they would be.
So there's questions coming in, but I want to, so I'm trying to decide the order, but there are a couple things that you've talked about that I want to highlight a little bit. And because you're a town, then to my colleague Christine's comments in the chat that different, of course, some of you are towns, some of you are cities, and the process of these sorts of things can be different based on the entity. And so one thing, Sierra, that you said early on is that the housing, in your case, the housing authority was the entity that drove the effort to create an affordable housing trust. And in a town, it oftentimes actually is a board, not typically the housing authority, although it does happen. Oftentimes we see an affordable housing partnership or committee that's really the entity that's driving it. Oftentimes CPCs are a part of starting this effort. In some communities, the select board actually may appoint an ad hoc committee to study creating a trust and to make a recommendation and to move things forward. That's happened in communities like Concord and Lexington. In cities, it's oftentimes the city council or the mayor, sometimes together, but it usually seems to be one or the other. And housing activists are oftentimes involved in this as well. So it can look really different, a bit different on the city level. But I just appreciate you calling out that it does take some entity, some group of people to really start this and to move it forward. It's not just, there typically is a process, and it can take some time. The education alone is really critical and can take time. Another thing is that I like that you brought up is that while you had keyboards that you were focusing on and felt were critical in terms of decision making, you kind of mentioned or suggested that you pretty much talked to anyone who would listen, because of recognizing that with Open Town Meeting, you needed as many people familiar with the initiative and on board. Certainly, you wanted to know early if there was opposition or concerns. So those are two key things that jumped out at me that I really appreciated about your process. Emma, do you have other questions that you can bring forward?
Yes. There's one here that says our CPC is concerned about two things: losing control of the housing funds, and two, the use of funds for administrative funds. Is there a limit to how much can be used for admin?
So the issues, the challenges in some communities between the CPC and the housing trust, that's real. It exists in a lot of different communities. I've done a variety of different things around kind of how do trusts and CPCs work together, and some recommendations around that. One thing that we would recommend is that the trusts start really early. And in the case of Southampton, they actually were talking to the CPC before they even created a trust. So they wanted to make sure that the CPC was on board, was a participant, and that they were having conversations early around how they would work together, and not just assuming that the CPC would transfer funds, but really having that conversation. So I think that that's important. Once a trust is created, I think that those conversations need to continue, and that you just need to work on building trust. And that might be that the trusts do the initial work of creating goals and strategies and really outlining the kind of work that you're going to be doing. Maybe that will help the CPC feel comfortable and the broader community feel comfortable about transferring funds to the trust. It may look a little bit different in different communities, but start the conversations early and keep them consistent. So some communities, they want to have a member of the CPC on the housing trust. This community like Brewster has done that, and they feel that that helps with communication and building trust. That could be a strategy. And in terms of use of funds for administrative funds, so under CPA, there's the support category, and it has over time been seen as allowable to use that for a position like a housing coordinator that can help staff CPA eligible activities, and that one of that is to support the housing trust. So there isn't really a limit unless the community puts a limit on that, because it would go under support and not CPA admin. So I'm hoping that that covers those. And then so would it be appropriate to discuss the why form a housing trust fund? What financial assistance is available to a housing trust that would not otherwise be able for a city or town to access? I don't know. I'm not quite understanding that. Emma, are you understanding that?
Well, I think part of what Sierra had touched on was this is more the question about why form than the financial assistance, but that it really helps communities be nimble and acting quickly. So maybe if you want to speak to that first part of the question, and Cynthia, if you can clarify the second part a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Just whether there are pots of money in the state that a housing trust fund can access that, say, an affordable housing committee could not. Because the way we're operating right now with affordable housing committee, you know, the CPC is not threatened. We ask them for the money for specific things. I thought a housing trust fund, because it's so regulated by the state, might have access to other sources of money. I wouldn't think that the CPC would be a primary funder for creating substantial housing. You'd need other resources.
Yes, absolutely. So with an affordable housing trust, it's a board that's volunteers. We would never suggest that the trust actually try to be a developer of affordable housing. And because it's a municipal entity, then it means procurement plays a role, and that makes the cost of development much more expensive. So it still would be an entity that's more helping to perhaps be engaged. We're seeing more trusts engaged in helping to dispose of municipal land for affordable housing. So doing initial pre-development work, and that some of that could be funded by the trust using CPA funds or other funds. We're seeing more trusts engaged in writing requests for proposals and then reviewing applications and really helping to move affordable housing on municipal land forward. And then part of that could be contributing funds to the development so that the developer can take that to receive when they're applying for state and federal funds. So it's a part of showing local support for the development, which the state requires, the state looks for. So an advantage, and why we encouraged Southampton to have a flyer that looked at the benefits, why a trust, is because some communities will say, well, we already have the CPC, but with the Community Preservation Act, the CPC members are representing a variety of different topics. They're having to do open space and recreation, historic preservation, and affordable housing. Affordable housing is particularly challenging. It's really complex. And so to have CPC members who were on many CPCs, there's only one person that comes from housing, from the Housing Authority, to expect them all to really understand affordable housing and to really be able to dig in and help move affordable housing forward. It's a lot to ask. So one advantage is having a trust board that's just focused on affordable housing, and the statute gives a variety of different powers where, unlike affordable housing committee or partnership, they may not have the same flexibility and the same degree of power in order to engage in the real estate market. So there can be distinct advantages to having a trust. At the same time, it's not necessarily the answer for every community. And it's really important that we, in our communities that we're talking about, can we sustain another board? And for small communities, that can be particularly challenging. So we have seen in some communities where they've created a trust because they want to have an entity that has the ability to move like a trust, but they've, in some communities, have actually absorbed the affordable housing committee or partnership, sometimes creating like a subcommittee under the trust to continue to do the kind of work that the partnership or the committee was doing, but to not have to have two different boards of people, because in some communities that's just is not possible. So I hope that helps a little bit.
And another question here, Sierra, I think this is one that you could speak to. How did Southampton develop the housing authority in the first place? And did you feel that was an important first step?
Well, I don't necessarily have the answer to that first question because that was before my time. But anytime a committee is created, it's created as part of, I think it's created as a bylaw in our town, or as part of sort of the town master plan. And so our housing authority has been around for a long time, but it is kind of odd that we have a housing authority and we have no housing that we actually manage. It's very confusing for people. We get applications for housing assistance that we are unable to answer. But I think it's great just to have an entity whose job it is to care about affordable housing, because other people have, like I mentioned, there's so many other priorities and people are stretched so thin that when your only job is to care about housing, it really helps you sort of focus on moving this forward. And so I think in that sense, it was an important first step because we cared enough and it was kind of like our main goal that we were able to push it forward and make it happen.
So one other thing I wanted to bring up that Sierra mentioned, I'm just seeing it in my notes, is that she referenced that when they were digging in, the ad hoc committee was digging in to write the bylaw for Southampton. Sierra suggested that I said to limit any restrictions on the statute, the trust statute. And I just want to explain a little bit more that the trust statute does allow for, out of the 16 powers that are granted explicitly in the statute, it does allow for powers to be modified as long as it's in line with the statute. And this means that essentially communities could add powers, but they can also modify the powers. And there are communities that do some modifications of the powers. Usually it's the big ones, like the statute does allow a trust to borrow funds. And in some communities, they might require a 2/3 vote of trustees in order to borrow, or they might limit that it can only be a certain percentage of the trust. They can only borrow up to a certain percentage of the trust assets. They might set those kind of limitations on it. But there is the section where it just outlines the structure of the trust, how many people are on it, who sits on it. And Sierra did reference that as well, that some communities, the statute only requires 5 members. Some communities will allow or require 7 or 9, and those are the most typical numbers. And then they might give a little bit of guidance of who sits on the trust board. So they might want representation from certain boards, and we would just suggest that you do that cautiously, not wanting to overburden people that are already on boards. But it can be helpful with communication. In some communities, they might require a staff person. So Brewster has a town administrator, has a position on the trust board, or an appointee. And so they wanted a paid staff person to be represented, which is rare, but it seems like it is helpful with communication across boards and with the other volunteer board members, residents. The bylaw or the ordinance might suggest people with certain skills, certain backgrounds in affordable housing, housing development, in real estate law. They might suggest that people be appointed with these kind of skills. Again, we just caution to try not to be too prescriptive, because 1, you could end up excluding someone who could be a really great trustee. But 2, as time goes by, it can be more and more difficult to fill all the seats on the trust, and then your trust can become really ineffective. So that was kind of the reason why we suggest to not be too prescriptive, just because you don't want to. A big benefit of the trust is the flexibility to be able to move within the real estate market and in the community to be effective, and you just don't want to make it too restrictive where it may limit the ability to do that in the long term. So I just want to give a little bit more clarity to that of why we suggest being cautious with your restrictions. Emma, any other questions? Or at this point, we have a few minutes. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, you could do that as well.
One just came in that goes off what you were just talking about. Do all members need to reside in the city or town?
So you do not need to reside within the city or the town unless your bylaw or your ordinance requires that. So we do have some communities where they explicitly write that into the bylaw or ordinance that you need to be a resident. But we also have communities that they don't, and there are some communities where there's someone that doesn't live in the community that's on the trust. We have one community that I know of, Beverly. They actually have 5 members on their trust, and 3 of them are municipal employees. I don't know if they all live in the community or not. I'm assuming that the mayor has to. But the other 2, I'm not sure if they do. So that's the only community that I know of where the majority are municipal staff. But it really depends on the community whether you're going to have that restriction or not. I think there's at least one community that I've seen where they allow a couple seats to be people that don't live in the community, but the majority are residents.
Thanks. Can a housing trust buy and develop property for resale as affordable units? And if so, are they subject to prevailing wage laws?
Yes, so if the trust is the developer, the trust has to follow, is subject to 30B to procurement laws, so it makes it much more expensive. So we just don't advise communities to be buying and selling. There are some trusts where they have a small scale homeownership program, a buy down program. A community like Norfolk, they do buy single family homes, and then they do some rehab on them and they resell them. So that could be a model if you're interested in that kind of a scale. There are ways around it, but each house requires a lot of subsidy because the cost is expensive and they do have to follow procurement laws. We have another community that they decided to be the developer of renovating some smaller municipal buildings into affordable housing. We advised them against it because of the complexity and the cost. They decided to move forward, and they have since come out and said, yes, we would not do this again. We regret doing this. So we would always suggest that your trust not be the developer. And we also, just because of seeing the experience in some communities, we've had trusts where they've purchased small scale houses, 1 family, 2 family houses, thinking that they would hold them as rental homes and that they would maintain them and rent them out. And it's just, when you're a volunteer board and the scale that you're going to have is really costly per unit, and oftentimes trusts aren't thinking about capital costs down the road and just the long-term costs of holding property. So we don't recommend it, given that you're a volunteer board. If you're structured differently and you have a paid person that's skilled at this and they're able to, maybe, but a better model is just partnering with affordable housing developers, which can be for-profit, they can be nonprofit developers, and some of your communities have a community development corporation. Maybe some housing authorities have the capacity, but helping to fund other entities to buy and hold the property and manage it.
And can you clarify how housing trust funds can be used to pay salaries? Just the limits around that, and if it's unusual. So
typically the more effective housing trusts have some kind of paid staff support. It could be just administrative. It could be someone who's more technical, perhaps helping to run a program for the trust, like an emergency rent assistance program, which happened during the pandemic. Several of our trusts were actually the ones that stepped up and initiated emergency rent assistance programs. Those actually, they hired a nonprofit entity to manage those programs. Some have a municipal staff person that maybe is a part-time person, and then they take on additional hours to do some administrative support for the trust. And then the trust can contribute the funds toward that part of the salary. You need to be careful if you're using CPA funds, that CPA funds cannot take the place of existing municipal funds. So if you already have a full-time town planner, for example, who's paid with municipal funds, you can't then use CPA funds to have part of their job be to support the trust. That's supplanting, and you can't do that with CPA funds. So, but we do have communities where they hire, say, a part-time housing coordinator, and they use CPA funds or other trust funds, and that person helps to support the trust with the trust work and other eligible activities, CPA activities, if it's CPA funds, if you're using other funds that just follow any restrictions on the other funds. But I don't know of any trust that has more than a part-time, maybe 2/3 time. I don't think any have a full-time staff person, but it's very common that they have some kind of support and that trust funds pay for that person's time. Hope that helps.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Can you clarify the relationship and similarities or the connectedness, I guess, of an affordable housing trust and an affordable housing trust fund? It says, does the fund make it easier for the trust to use money?
So technically, yeah, technically the statute is the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So that's what they are. They're affordable housing trust funds. So we oftentimes just drop the fund and say trust, and that might be confusing for people who are thinking other forms of trust, but what we're all talking about here today is they're actually trust funds. Sorry for that confusion. So I want to be sensitive to the time that it's 12:51, and we're going to wrap up this session. And I thank Sierra so much for being here and for giving us a great outline of the really incredible work done in Southampton to establish an affordable housing trust. It was a pleasure to work with your small group of folks. It was a great group of people that were really passionate, and we're really excited to see how things move forward in Southampton. And we hope that the rest of you will take a little bit of a break and come back at 1 o'clock, and we're going to dig into, now that you have a trust, how do you get things moving? How do you get going? Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So session 2 today is looking at affordable housing trusts and how do we get started? Some recommendations and suggestions for how new trusts should move forward, and trusts that perhaps are struggling to maybe go back and do some additional groundwork. So again, I'm Shelley Gehring with MHP's Community Assistance Team, and my colleague Emma McGurran is supporting us here today. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put those in the chat. You can also message Emma directly if you'd like to, and she'll bring those questions forward. So MHP, for those of you who may not be as familiar, we are a quasi-state agency in the state, and we're focused on increasing the supply of affordable housing and access to housing across the state. And we have 4 main arms to our work. One is the Center for Housing Data. We have a small team of folks that are collecting, analyzing, and sharing data to help inform effective policy on the local, regional, and state level. We have our community assistance team that Emma and I are a part of, and we're really focused on building local capacity to support affordable housing, as well as disposing of municipal land and housing authority land for affordable housing. We have a lending team that has lent over $1.4 billion to help create and preserve over 27,000 units of affordable rental housing. And then we have a home ownership team that is focused on helping to increase access to affordable housing, for home ownership for more moderate income households. So today, for this session, we're going to spend a little bit of time just looking at what a municipal affordable housing trust is, for those of you who may not be as familiar as others, and then some of the basic things to do as you're getting started. And then we'll dig a little bit into creating a mission statement, goals and strategies, and just some suggestions and recommendations for how you may want to consider doing this. And then looking at establishing guidelines for your trust to create a structure that you can work within and that helps articulate what your role is and how you function in your community. So what is an affordable housing trust fund? This is a municipal entity. It's a public entity. It's created by your local legislative body, just a majority vote. The purpose is to create and preserve affordable housing for low and moderate income households. And it's led by a board of trustees that's appointed locally. And because it is a municipal entity, it means that, like your other boards, your municipal boards, it's subject to public procurement, designer selection, conflict of interest, and public meeting laws. This trust statute is Mass General Law, Chapter 44, Section 55C. And I like to just point out the purpose that's outlined in the statute, because sometimes communities want the trust to be the entity that does everything pertaining to housing. But the purpose actually is fairly limited. It's to provide for the creation and preservation of affordable housing in municipalities for the benefit of low and moderate income households, and for the funding of community housing as defined in accordance with the Community Preservation Act. So it's really not everything. It's pretty limited. It's really about creation and preservation of affordable housing. And several years ago, the trust statute was modified so that everything that's allowed in the CPA statute under community housing, that's allowable for a trust. And that is the key aspect of that is the support verb under CPA, that it wasn't exclusively in the trust statute, and now it is. So everything that would fall under support under CPA is allowable for a trust to engage in. And another thing about this purpose is that it's really focused on low and moderate income only. It's not mixed income beyond that. It's not market rate. The one caveat is that the trust statute does not define low and moderate income. So we encourage communities to define that for yourself, and to start by looking at existing definitions of low and moderate income and other programs in the state, and to be really explicit with what area median income you're focusing on in your community. If you're at the first session, Sierra did bring up that the trust statute does require that the Housing Trust Fund report back to your Community Preservation Committee on an annual basis if you receive CPA funds. You need to report back how you're spending those funds, because the CPC needs to be recording this in their annual report, the CP3 report that they submit to the Department of Revenue every September. Unfortunately, over the years, we've had a lot of CPA funds transferred to trusts, and then it's not reported back to how those funds are actually being spent or if they're being spent. So when we're doing advocacy on the statewide level to increase CPA funds, particularly with the state CPA trust fund, the funds that are redistributed out to communities, it's hard to make the case around housing because we just don't have solid data. So we want to make sure that trusts are reporting back to CPCs, and that CPCs are recording that in your CP3 report every year. Very broadly, a housing trust can address affordable housing needs in your community. The trust can really help support local control of housing initiatives. So you can have funds available to initiate affordable housing development. The trust can engage in real estate activity, buying and selling real estate. Because the trust doesn't have to go back to town meeting or the city council, as the Community Preservation Committee does have to if you have CPA, it means that the trust can move more nimbly, can respond more quickly, oftentimes, to either the request from a developer, or if there's a parcel in town that you think you would like to purchase that makes sense for affordable housing. And the trust, as a municipal entity, you can be collecting funds from a variety of sources as well. And we're seeing more and more creativity in communities about where they're, the kind of funds that they're using. The trust statute is actually quite short, and it's not all that specific. It does require a minimum of 5 trustees. And as I said in the first session, some communities have chosen 7 members, some have chosen 9. We only have a couple communities that I know of that are over 10, but that becomes really large, and it can be more difficult to really be nimble and to move forward just because you have a much bigger board. So most are, I think, around 7 members. The statute does require the chief executive officer be a trustee on the trust board. And it doesn't explicitly say in the trust statute, the CEO or an appointee. So my read is that means that in a city, the mayor has to be on the trust, but we do have some cities that allow the mayor to appoint someone. In a town with a select board, it means that one member of the select board must be on the trust board. The trustees are appointed by the mayor. The city council in some forms of city are engaged in this process as well. And in a town, the select board is the appointing board. The trust statute requires 2-year terms, and many communities stagger these so that you never have full turnover of the board in any given year. And then the trustees, as with other municipal boards, are considered public agents, special municipal employees, just like your other boards. The trust statute gives 16 powers that are outlined in the statute. And these are just some of the big ones: accepting and receiving real property, personal property, or money, purchase and retain real or personal property, sell, lease, exchange, or convey any personal, mixed, or real property. And these powers can be added to if a community wants to, that's in line with the statute. They can also be modified, which occasionally happens, particularly with some of these big powers that they might require, for example, a 2/3 vote to purchase property or to borrow against trust funds. We do encourage communities to not modify them too much, at least not to restrict them too much, because part of the benefit of having a municipal affordable housing trust is that the trust is able to be somewhat nimble in the real estate market, which is really important, particularly when we're working on affordable housing. Just one example of Brewster, they had one form of a housing trust, but it was pretty limited. And in 2018, they ended up dissolving that and establishing a municipal affordable housing trust fund. They transferred the $80,000 that had been in the previous trust to the new municipal affordable housing trust fund. Their bylaw requires 7 trustees, select board member, which is required by statute. They give their town administrator a seat or the town administrator's designee. And in recent years, actually since the inception of their trust, this person has appointed the assistant town administrator. So they do have they require a municipal staff person to be on the trust board. And this isn't all that common, but I think that it's been helpful with communication between boards and with residents that are on the board as well, just to have someone who pretty much knows everyone, all the decision makers in the town. They require that their affordable housing partnership have a representative on their trust board, that the community preservation committee have a representative, and that their planning board have a representative. So they require 3 boards to have a representative on their trust. For Brewster, they felt that this was important for communication across boards. In some communities, it's difficult to have this much board representation because board members are oftentimes already on multiple boards, and it can be stretching people really thin. It can be hard to get a quorum in some communities with their trust. So we encourage you to be really thoughtful about your trust makeup, the makeup of your trust board. And then they just have 2 citizens at large. They do restrict one of the powers, that allocations over $50,000 are subject to the select board approval. This is very restrictive. And I don't know of any other, I don't think I know of any other community that's this restrictive. $50,000 is a very low bar when we're talking about affordable housing. But they do have that one restriction. And then when they started out, they right away dug in to create a mission statement and identify goals and priority initiatives. They had a housing forum inviting the community to come hear about how they were thinking about their role in the community, their mission statement, their goals, and to offer some feedback, to really have open conversation. And I think that they've had other housing forums beyond the initial one. And this is something that we would encourage, that the trust be finding ways to communicate with folks in the town or the city, to request feedback and input. The Community Preservation Committee, for those of you who have one, are supposed to be doing an annual meeting in the community to get feedback, to get input. And we would suggest that the trust do a similar kind of, create a similar sort of process. So some key things just from working in a lot of different communities, both helping to establish a trust and communities that have had a trust for a while. There are some things that we suggest. And one really is to start out by identifying your housing needs in your community. And a lot of our communities have some kind of housing plan. You might have a housing production plan or housing needs analysis. You might have a housing section to your master plan. We really would encourage trustees to start with this information. If these plans are over about 5 years old, then we would suggest that the trust start by considering how they can get this plan updated, whether it's a process that they do, whether they partner with, typically would be partnering with a community development department if you have that, a town planner. If you have an affordable housing partnership or committee, work with them as well. Housing data that's over 5 years old is pretty old. Things have changed a lot in our communities and with our housing crisis over the last 5 years. And we really suggest that you start with current data to really give you a broad view of the local housing landscape and what's happening in terms of costs and which segments of your community are really struggling to make ends meet around housing in your community. And when these plans are being developed, we urge you to not develop them in a vacuum. It should not just be people who are housing people or the planning office, the town planner that's involved in this. This really should be engaging people from across the community in a variety of different boards, a variety of different walks of life. When you're moving forward with housing plans, you really want buy-in from the broad community. You want people across the community to understand the housing needs. Because when you start talking about investing in housing development, you want people to understand the needs first. Many people will have stories or anecdotes about what's going on with housing in the community. And those can be really important to help to reinforce the data or to highlight things that perhaps the data just isn't able to collect. So doing both can be really helpful. But if you just go based on anecdotes or stories here and there, you could miss broader trends in the community. So we really urge you to have current data and to be really getting familiar with that data as you're starting out as a trust. You can also take some time to learn about affordable housing finance. This is not so that you become an expert. That's not the expectation, but just so that you have a familiarity about what it takes to finance affordable housing in Massachusetts, what the process is, some of the steps. We have some great resources, some past trainings on the housing toolbox. One specifically geared towards affordable housing trusts and CPCs was one of my colleagues, Anne, from our lending department. She did an overview about housing finance from the lender perspective and really touched on low-income housing tax credits and walked through the many different funding sources that a developer has to access in order to make affordable housing happen in the state. We have another one with Christine, who is the head of real estate development at Harbor Homes on the North Shore. And she really talked from the developer perspective of what does it take for a developer to put together an affordable housing deal, and touching on needing to all the requirements for the lender, for the state, but then also requirements that communities oftentimes put on developers and having to negotiate the many different requirements. So they're both really great sessions that I would urge you to take a look at if you haven't seen them. Another thing you can do as a new trust, and I suggest this to new trusts, is to build relationships with affordable housing developers. Many of you have a community development corporation that works in your community where you're in their catchment area. You can invite one of these developers to actually attend one of your trust meetings and to go through a pro forma of a real development, help you to understand all the different costs, all the different potential income sources, the process to access state and federal resources. Ask the developer to talk about why local funds are so critical and at what point do they need local funds to be allocated. We have a couple trusts that have taken me up on this. They've invited a nonprofit developer. I'm sorry, not just nonprofit. Some of them have done, one did a for-profit developer, but developers that know affordable housing development. One community invited the local CDC, Community Development Corporation, as well as the local Habitat chapter to come in and talk because they have really different structures, really different models. But it helped the trustees to understand what it takes, what developers, the pressure that developers are under, the kind of questions that developers are having to answer. And it helped them to set up how they were going to structure their funds and to understand how important their funds are early on in the development process. So again, it's not to become an expert, but it's just to have some familiarity, some understanding, and then hopefully to be able to talk about that a little bit more clearly in the community. Another thing we suggest early on is to decide critical elements up front. Many of our communities have different boards that are doing some piece of affordable housing. Some have multiple housing entities. Really urge you to clarify your roles early on across boards. So if you already have a housing authority, or you already have a housing partnership or committee, or other boards that are doing some parts of affordable housing, have conversations early and often. Make sure that you're understanding the differences between your roles, so that you're not overlapping, so that you're not stepping on toes. I've just seen so many times where this doesn't happen, and then it's down the road where conflict comes up, and it likely could have been avoided if early on there was clarity between boards of the differences between the roles. Talk about how your boards will work together. Identify ways that you can collaborate, and then talk up early about who's going to fund what. So we have some communities where the Community Preservation Committee has been around and they have funded housing efforts. And there may be conflict when a trust comes in and wants to be the one funding housing efforts. So early on, talk about, are there things that the CPC will continue to fund versus what the trust might focus on? So we have one community where the trust is really coming in new, and they're going to be focusing on development, affordable housing development, helping to move development forward. Whereas another entity, the Housing Authority, had managed programs, and they're both seeking CPC funds, but the Housing Authority is going to continue housing programs like rent assistance and a buy down program. The trust, as the new entity, is going to focus on development. So they had those conversations early. They decided that together early on so that they shouldn't have conflict down the road. The graph on the slide is just something that Manchester did for their housing production plan, where you see on the left, they had different strategies, housing strategies. They had shorter term versus a little bit longer term. And then on the right, they had the lead boards that they identified to provide accountability, but also so that there isn't the stepping on toes, hopefully. And there could be other entities. You could have a housing authority involved in this, affordable housing committee or partnership. There might be a nonprofit that's particularly active that's a part of this exercise. But the more clarity you have up front, the easier it will be moving forward. And then this kind of work takes teamwork. It takes trustees that are committed, that really have some time. The board has to be a working board. It needs to be people who really don't just show up for meetings, but that can help a little bit beyond that. Oftentimes, you need a chairperson that has some project management capacity that can help move things forward. And then the most successful trusts seem to have some kind of paid support, whether that's technical, where it's helping with feasibility analysis on municipal land, perhaps, or trust-owned land, or administrative support, helping with just the communication between boards, agendas, minutes, some of that work to support the trustees. So if you're considering creating a trust, or you have a new one, we really would urge you to spend some time thinking about how you can bring on some paid capacity. And then we're always reminding communities to ensure transparency. We all know that housing development in general, but affordable housing in particular, is controversial in our communities, for better or for worse. So be transparent with what you're doing. You might want to consider joint board appointments if that feels helpful with communication across important boards. Report back regularly to different boards in town and perhaps different staff people. When you do invest in different affordable housing developments or programs, promote those efforts. Make sure people know that that's what you're investing in, and use a webpage or social media if your community uses that to help people find you. So really don't make it hard for people to find the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. This is just some sections of Westport's Affordable Housing Trust Fund webpage. They have their mission and some of the ways that they're going to go about implementing their mission. They have their staff contact, the trustees' names, and then they have some links. What I think that they don't have their bylaw right here, and we would always suggest that you have your bylaw on your webpage, so it's easy for people to pull it up and see how the town has structured your particular housing trust. And then we have some trust funds where they really just want to have some funds in their account. They want to operate similar to a community preservation committee where they just review applications and they just want to make funding decisions. We have some trusts where they're wanting to initiate. Maybe there's less going on in their community, less capacity, and they really want to be a part of initiating. So during the pandemic, we saw several housing trusts actually initiate emergency rent assistance programs. We're seeing more and more trusts engage with helping to dispose of municipal land for affordable housing development. They're helping with the initial pre-development work on a municipal site. They are helping with writing a request for proposals, reviewing applications that have come in, and then oftentimes helping with the permitting process as well. We have trusts that are engaged in advocacy work in the community. This may be advocating for affordable housing developments that the trust not specifically funding, but it could be, we have a trust that's really engaged in helping to advocate for different 40B developments. So developments that are being proposed under Chapter 40B that they think are beneficial to the community, that they're a part of supporting it at hearings. They may also be active in supporting developments that fall under inclusionary zoning that's not specifically something that they may be funding. And then some trusts are engaged in education. And we would just suggest that you have this conversation up front about how you're going to operate, the way that you're going to function in the community, and that you be explicit about that. And then it's great to look around at what other trusts are doing and to see if that might work for you, but you shouldn't assume that just because another community is doing something or a program, that it necessarily falls under the trust statute, or that it's legal. You really are responsible for doing your own due diligence. So you can get ideas from other communities, but just make sure that you're practicing your own due diligence to make sure that what you're doing is in line with not only the trust statute, but other laws around fair housing, around procurement, and so forth. So that was a lot. And I just want to ask Emma if at this point there are questions that it would make sense to touch on before we move into mission statements, goals, and strategies.
Yeah, let's take a little break and take a look at some of these. Going back to when you were talking about the ranges of defining affordability, someone asks, some trusts are defining affordable as 110 or 120% AMI, area median income, or more. Is there a limit to how affordable is defined?
So we do suggest that you look at existing definitions for low and moderate income. So if some communities want everything that their trust invests in to be eligible for the subsidized housing inventory, the SHI, that would be a ceiling of 80% area median income. If you're using CPA funds, then that is a ceiling of 100% of the area median income. CPA can only go up to 100. The state's Affordable Housing Trust fund goes up to 110%. They define moderate income as 110% of the area median income. If you're going to go above those, you really need to be able to make the case of why moderate income goes up to 120 or 150 or beyond that in your community. You definitely want to make sure that it's what you're investing in as a moderate income unit is not comparable to market rate. You don't want to be putting public funds into something that's akin to market rate. So you need to just be thoughtful about looking at the demographics in your community and what realistically should count as moderate income. And if you're going to go beyond other existing definitions that the state uses, you just need to be able to make the case for that and know that there isn't a hard definition for that or a ceiling for that. You define that. You just need to be able to make the case for it.
CPA in our community has gone to town meeting to distribute funds. Is the recommendation that CPA funds be moved under the trust so it can be nimble? If so, what kind of safeguards are recommended?
So we always suggest that you have a grant agreement between the CPC and any entity that the CPC is allocating funds to. That includes the trust. There are different models in different communities. So some communities, the CPC will make a recommendation to transfer funds to the trust, and they won't require the trust to apply. They'll just submit it as part of the their allocations for that year, and then it goes before town meeting. In some communities, they want the trust to apply for funds, and they might, in some communities, they allow for the trust to apply for funds without it being necessarily a specific purpose, but so that the trust has it to be able to be nimble. And that is ideal to have some funds like that. Some communities require the trust to apply for funds for a specific purpose. And that's the only way that they'll transfer the funds or recommend that the funds be transferred. So it looks a little bit different in different communities, but ideally, the trust will have some funds that are that they have to use for CPA eligible uses, of course, but where it's not necessarily pinned down of exactly how, so that they can be a little bit flexible. That's ideal, but it looks different in different communities, and it may take some trust building to get to that point. And there may be other funds that the trust can access outside of CPA funds that they can use for this kind of flexible funding, and maybe CPAs for a specific purpose. So it can look different in different communities.
Great. And then last one before I think it makes sense to move on is, can or should the citizen at large trustee seat be a member of an existing municipal board? Can you just elaborate on kind of designating who sits on the board?
So in the case of Brewster, they require a few boards to have a representative on the trust fund board. And then they have two at large, where it can be two people that aren't connected to any of those boards. And I think that having at least a couple seats where it's people that aren't connected to any boards or necessarily any specific requirement can be helpful, because there can be a lot of people in our community that are really enthusiastic about affordable housing, or are really particularly impacted by the housing crisis, and would add really important voices. Something that I didn't bring up that I could have is that we have some communities where they're reserving seats on the trust for someone or more than one person, that, like Brookline, for people who live in affordable housing, so that you're bringing in that voice, where it's not just people who are doing this outside of kind of their lived experience, but you're bringing in people with lived experience. There are some communities that are trying to be sensitive to having renters on the Affordable Housing Trust Board, and not just homeowners, which are oftentimes the people who are represented on our municipal boards, so that there's just broader experience on the trust and helping with planning as well. So there are a lot of different ways that the trust boards can be structured that I think can be really beneficial.
Great, thanks, Shelley.
Great. So I want to transfer a little bit to get more specific around creating a mission statement, goals, and strategies. And one thing that I really want to make clear is that we really are encouraging trusts, particularly brand new trusts, to spend time doing some groundwork to create a structure, a framework for you to work within. We've seen so many times over the years where a trust is established, and then the board just tries to jump in, and they don't really have they haven't done any kind of foundational work. They haven't created a roadmap for themselves. They haven't really identified their role in the community. And we really would urge, even though the needs are really dire and really critical, we really would encourage you to take some time, and it could be several months, to create a really good foundation to be able to move forward from. So one is writing a mission statement, identifying what you want to accomplish. This is helpful not only for trustees to kind of focus the trustees, but also it helps the community understand how you see your role in the community. So a mission statement is a declaration of your organization's purpose. It should direct the organization toward its ultimate destination, and you need to keep it short. It should be kept short. So 3 key aspects of a mission statement is identifying what you do, how you do it and who you do it for. In just looking at a lot of different mission statements for housing trusts, the 1 in 3, what you do and who you do it for, is pretty common. It's less common to say how you do it. I think that's hard to do succinctly for a lot of communities, and it might be hard to do just starting out. But I think it can be helpful in conveying how you see your role in the community. So I just pulled up 3 mission statements from existing housing trusts that I think are touching on these different aspects of a mission statement. One is Amherst. It says Amherst's mission as an instrument of town government. You'll sometimes see trusts put this kind of language, instrument of town government, in their mission statement. It's as I think that they're kind of reminding the community and themselves that they're not outside of the community, outside of the municipal government. They're a part of it. But the trust mission is to promote the town's affordable housing priorities as determined through the most recent town housing plan. This is sometimes what trusts decide to do, as you'll see in Winchester's down below, where they reference an existing housing plan. And I think it's reinforcing that the trust is not outside of the community. The trust is a part of the community and ultimately a part of helping to implement already identified priorities in the community, particularly to create safe, decent, and affordable housing for our most vulnerable populations. So what they're doing is to create safe, decent, and affordable housing. They're doing it through the most recent housing plan, the priorities there identified there, and it's for the most vulnerable populations in their community. In Grafton, to provide for the creation, preservation, and retention of affordable housing. So that's what they're doing, and rental housing in town of Grafton for the benefit of low and moderate income households. That's who it's for. And they're doing it through a variety of programs, including education and advocacy. And then Winchester's, the mission of the trust is to support and sustain an inclusive and socioeconomically diverse community, consistent with the policy objectives of the most recent Winchester Housing Production Plan through investment, education, and advocacy. So they're kind of putting what they do and who they do it for in the support and sustain an inclusive and socioeconomically diverse community. And while it's not as explicit as low and moderate income, they are getting at that around socioeconomic, the language of socioeconomic and inclusivity. And then they do that through investment, education, and advocacy. And of these 3 trusts, the Winchester one is the most recent. They've only been around for a couple of years. And next, after you have a mission statement, after you've kind of identified what your role is in the community and thought about how you're going to operate more generally, we would suggest that you dig in to start creating goals. And there are different ways, there are different frameworks for this. I'm presenting one, looking at goals, strategies, tasks. I'm not saying that this is the only way to do it or to frame it, but this is the one that I'm going to present today. Part of the message that I want to send is that a lot of our housing production plans or housing needs analysis, a lot of the goals that are identified in these can be really very general. And even some of the strategies can be really general. And my advice to trusts is to really dig in to create more measurable goals. So start with whatever plan you have and how broad those goals may be. Start there, but then drill down and make the goals more specific and defined. We really encourage trusts to pick 2 or 3 things. Oftentimes our housing production plans might have 8 goals. They might have 10, a lot of different things, a lot of different ideas. But as a volunteer board, it's unrealistic to think that you could touch on all of those effectively at the same time. So really encourage trust boards to pick 2 or 3 things, 2 or 3 goals, make them well-defined and measurable, and then create strategies and tasks to support that, to really create a roadmap for you moving forward so that you don't get into the point where you're spinning wheels because the needs are so overwhelming and your resources are limited. So with goals, they are well-defined, targeted statements that give direction and focus. These should be measurable. Think SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. So I'm giving a couple examples here. One is that could be a trust goal is to increase homeownership by 5% among moderate income households within the next 2 years. Oftentimes in our housing plans, there may be a goal about increase access to homeownership, something really general. So this is making it more specific. It's trying to be a SMART goal. It's measurable, it's specific, hopefully it's achievable, and you'll have to decide whether it's realistic for your community or not, and it is time-bound. Another one that this is an actual goal from one of our trusts is to create 100 units of low moderate income rental and homeownership housing units over the next 5 years. So again, it's being more specific, measurable, time-bound, and for them, they felt like it was achievable and realistic. It might be a little bit of a stretch for this community. It's a very small community that has this goal. So it might be a little bit of a stretch, but sometimes stretching our boards, like our housing trust boards, can be a good thing for our communities, particularly with something that's as necessary as affordable housing. And the next is strategies, the approach you take to achieve a goal. So strategy may be seen as a blueprint or a game plan. It's a journey. It's a longer duration. So for the goal about increasing homeownership by 5%, a strategy could be to establish a down payment assistance program. So it's a blueprint plan. It's a way to move forward on your goal, and it's a longer duration. It's a program. For the goal of creating 100 units of low moderate income rental and homeownership housing units, one strategy could be to provide funds to support accessory dwelling unit creation. So this is a community that has an accessory dwelling unit bylaw. And this is a real strategy that they have, is to support the creation of ADUs under this new bylaw. And then the next step is tasks. So specific activities to execute your strategies. So tasks are the organized actions that help achieve a certain end, and a task you can think of as a trip, a short duration. So with the strategy to establish a down payment assistance program, a specific task could be create down payment assistance program application documents. It's a short-term thing. You do it now in order to support the strategy. And then for the strategy of providing funds to support accessory dwelling unit creation, a task could be to create ADU funding program parameters in line with the local ADU bylaw. So to get more specific about how are you going to distribute funds? What are the parameters around distributing funds for ADUs? So that's one model, but it helps you to get more specific, to create a roadmap for yourself. And this can be really helpful for those of you that also have a community preservation committee, because the committee is likely going to want to know what kinds of things are you going to be spending funds on? How much money are you going to be spending? Because this can help you create a budget, and it can help you to articulate your role, what you want to do with the CPC in the larger community. If you have to go before town meeting, it can help make the case for why you want funds, why you need funds. And then it's something to measure yourself against, that you can then come back the next year and you can look at what you've done, what you have been able to accomplish, what has been a challenge, how you're perhaps modifying your goals, strategies, tasks because of challenges that you had in the previous year. It can provide you as accountability, with accountability as a board, but also between different boards. And then once you've done that kind of work, or it doesn't necessarily have to be in this order, perhaps you do guidelines first, but or start your guidelines. But we do encourage communities to create guidelines, to outline in a document, and it doesn't have to be forever long. It can be more short and succinct, but that you put in guidelines, some of this information and how you're going to operate, how you're going to distribute funds, so that it's not only helps you, again, it helps focus your work, but it helps anyone who might want to access your funds to know how you're thinking, what your priorities are, and how you're going to structure funds, what are requirements to use the funds. It can help the larger community to understand how you function. And community preservation committees oftentimes have some of this as well. So this is just from Beverly's guidelines. These oftentimes are done just in-house. So certainly Beverly has a bit more capacity as a city, but we have towns like Brewster where they did this in-house as well. So we have examples that you can start with. You don't have to start from scratch. But the kinds of things that you may put in guidelines would be to have your mission statement, goals, and strategies out there so people can easily access them. You might identify some roles and responsibilities of the trust. So if there are specific responsibilities that are different from, say, an affordable housing partnership or committee, you could put that in here. You could identify if you're just a funding entity or if you're also helping to create programs or doing advocacy and education, you could put that in. I would suggest that you identify priority or eligible funding activities so that it's clear the kinds of things that you're going to, the kinds of applications you'll entertain. Stipulations around funding. So this is where I would define low and moderate income. If you have any income limits or any stipulations around deed restrictions, if you're using CPA funds and you're acquiring a real property interest, that's a restriction in perpetuity. If it's other funds, maybe there's some flexibility with that. But any kind of stipulations about the funds, I would put in here. How your expectations around monitoring affordability of developments that you are funding and reporting to the trust. The application process, timeline, selection criteria, and then an application form. So these are all the kinds of things you can have in guidelines, just to help create structure for your trust and to make it clear and easy for people to access how you're functioning and how they can access your resources or request your resources. So the kinds of things I like to close in when we're talking about trust is that when you're creating a trust, you're getting started, really be mindful of your local infrastructure, of the needs, but also the existing resources. You don't want your trust to be duplicating resources. You really want to find the niche or the areas that are that make the most sense for your trust to focus on. Develop goals that reflect identified needs. So not just preferences in the community or the path of least resistance, but really being thoughtful and mindful about around the identified needs, and then making sure that your work is in line with those needs, and then being real about your capacity. You are a volunteer board. You have the need is so great. Be really realistic about your capacity. And we have a lot of resources online. We have a newly updated operations manual that this was just released a couple weeks ago. And we have Data Town, Housing Toolbox, and Emma and I are here, as well as the rest of the community assistance team. We want to support your work. That was a lot. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if there are other questions that Emma would like to bring up.
Yes, there are a few. So there was some around advocacy and just a curiosity about any existing affordable housing trust funds who focus on advocacy, and also if your community has no CPA and no funds, does it make sense to establish an affordable housing trust fund that could start as an advocacy entity and then work to find funds?
Mm-hmm. So one model is the community of Medfield in the greater Boston area, that they, when their trust was established a few years ago, they actually, the town actually also through their through local election allocated $1 million or to bond $1 million to support their trust, to seed their affordable housing trust. And it wasn't under CPA funds, it was their municipal budget. But instead of drawing on those funds, the trust actually, the last that I heard, was still primarily focused on helping to support affordable housing developments in town that they felt were beneficial to the community. So advocate to some degree, that to me, that's kind of a part of advocacy, that it was so the different chapter 40B developments that they think are beneficial, they have written letters in support, they've gone to hearings to support them. There could be other ways that the trust could help move development through the planning process. I think that those could be really great ways, and that doesn't cost anything, it's time. So as far as I know, Medfield has not spent money, that this is the role that they've played in their community. They might also be helping move forward some developments that include affordable housing that are under inclusionary zoning or special permit that they're not directly funding. So I think that can be a great role. A trust without money can also start really looking at any land that the municipality owns and to start giving consideration to whether they might be conducive to affordable housing. The trust can be working closely with the town planner around that if you have a town planner. I think there are a variety of things that a trust could do without money. Of course, to update a housing plan, you need some money, and so you need to figure out where that comes from. But a trust could really spearhead and really drive updating a housing plan if you are able to access some funds, perhaps working with a regional planning agency. I think there are a lot of important roles, particularly for a new trust, to start establishing itself and start to build the capacity for the community to support more affordable housing, even if they don't yet have money.
That's helpful. And we're coming up on time. And so I guess one last question is, how does a local redevelopment authority fit into affordable housing development? And just maybe talking about kind of the interplay of different organizations, if there's anything you want to elaborate on there.
Yeah, I think that I don't know how many of our communities have a redevelopment authority. I think that's perhaps limited. It might just be cities. I'm not sure. Maybe not. I don't know of very many that are directly involved necessarily in the Affordable Housing Trust. It doesn't mean that they couldn't. It probably makes sense to at least have a relationship and open communication, because a trust is a municipal entity. You want to make sure that the trust is actively aware of what's going on in the community around planning and development. And so I think that there's a place for a relationship. I just don't know of really any models yet where the development authority is significantly involved, although there is a community where it's moving in that direction. But to me, that'd be a newer model.
That's helpful. And I know there are a number of questions we did not get to. I'm seeing 7 here on my list. So if there are some that we didn't answer and you're looking for more information, I'll put Shelley and my emails in the chat, and you can reach out to us directly if there's something that you would like elaboration on.
Are there maybe just a couple that you want we can go over just a couple minutes, because we don't start again until 2, that maybe we just touch on a couple?
Sure. Are there any examples you're aware of that like kind of share housing trust fund staff, such as one person who supports an affordable housing trust fund in 2 or 3 close by or neighboring communities?
Oh, so at this point, there's not a model for a regional affordable housing trust fund, at least without going through the legislature. There has been talk among different sections of the state that it would be helpful to have an easy way for multiple communities to partner in having a regional trust. I don't think anything's yet moved forward on that. But there definitely is conversation, and particularly for smaller communities and more rural parts of the state, I think it could be really beneficial. We do have just the model on Cape Cod of communities investing in affordable housing development outside of their community. So there have been multiple developers that have been able to access either CPA or specifically trust funds from multiple communities. But the community that the development is in is the only community that gets credit for the development on the subsidized housing inventory, because that's a region of the state where they appreciate the importance of helping to stabilize the rental housing market across communities. And so they've been willing to contribute funds outside the community. It's not the same thing as the same body. They're separate trusts and separate CPCs. But anyways, there is some conversation, particularly Western Mass, of an interest in a regional model. Right now, there's no enabling legislation to allow that, or enabling statute.
Do you have any examples of the kinds of real estate acquisitions done by an affordable housing trust? Does the affordable housing trust buy the land or land with existing housing? Who becomes the temporary or eventual owner of the property? I know you talked about this a little bit. Is there anything wanna?
So there are examples like in Westport, the community did own some land, but they need, in order to be able to build affordable housing on it, they needed an adjacent parcel for access to the municipal owned land. So the trust was a part of helping to purchase that adjacent to make the larger development feasible. We have, in some cases, the community is transferring surplus municipal land to the trust to dispose of for affordable housing. So that's been one model. In one case in Chelsea, it's tax title property that they're transferring to the trust to create home ownership opportunities, affordable home ownership opportunities. In another example, in Norwell, it was a surplus police station that the town transferred to the trust to then dispose of for affordable housing. And then there are examples where there were a couple trusts earlier on where they were buying smaller scale housing, thinking that they would hold on to it as rental housing, which they quickly learned was very expensive. So I don't have a whole lot of examples of larger kind of purchases, but you may be familiar that there are communities where they've used CPA funds to acquire a larger parcel for multiple CPA purposes, and sometimes for affordable housing. So I think Brewster is an example of that more recently, where they've set aside some of the land for affordable housing and some of it is for open space. So that's also something that a trust could work with the CPC to do if you're able to identify appropriate parcel.
That's great. How are
And
you
Probably
feeling
wrap
about?
up. Yeah, I think we should probably wrap up. So to give everyone a bit of a break, we hope you'll come back at 2 o'clock. We're gonna dig into how your local communities can support affordable housing development. We have Caitlin, who is the Executive Director of Metro West Collaborative Development. She's gonna talk through a couple different developments in 2 different communities, Medway and Hudson, and just offer some insight into what those communities did that really helped move their developments forward. We're also gonna touch a little bit on zoning and the way that zoning can support affordable housing as well. So thank you so much for being here, and we hope to see you back at 2.
And we'll be on the same link. So
Same link.
stay on.
Development on the we're now focused on supporting affordable housing on the local level. And we have invited the Executive Director of Metro West Collaborative Development, Caitlin Madden, to join us. And first, I just want to remind you that if you have questions about anything around the topic and for Caitlin specific, please put those in the chat. And you can also directly message Emma, my colleague Emma McGurran, who's here supporting these trainings today, if you would like, and she'll bring those forward. So I'm going to invite Caitlin to share her screen and to walk us through some of her experiences in, I think she's highlighting 2 specific communities, Medway and Hudson, and the spectacular affordable housing developments they have there, and sharing some of the things that the community did to help make that work. Caitlin.
Great, thank you so much, Shelley. Let me share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see that?
Can you make it full screen? You can see it a little bigger.
Let me see.
Maybe just zoom in.
All right, can you see all of it or just half of it when I do that?
I think that's better. Thanks.
Okay. All right, great.
Actually, no, we can just see half of it.
Okay. All right, well, I'm sorry, but I'm not sure. Let's see here. I'm not sure how to zoom in and still allow you to see the entire file. So is this okay?
Yeah, let's go like
Leave it
this.
the size. Okay, all right. Great. All right. Well, Hello again, everyone. My name is Caitlin Madden, and I'm the Executive Director of Metro West Collaborative Development. And I am delighted to be here with you today to talk about how affordable housing trusts can support housing creation. I was very encouraged when I saw how many people had registered for this session, because I think we're all aware of the desperate need for more housing options and more affordable housing in particular. And affordable housing trusts play a critically important role in making housing production actually happen in our communities. So today you've heard about what it takes to establish an affordable housing trust, how to get started and identify goals and strategies. And now you're probably wondering, okay, once we have a trust and goals, how do we actually get housing built? So today I'm going to share Metro West CD's experience with producing affordable housing and talk about how affordable housing trusts play a key role in the process. Okay. All right, so just a quick roadmap of where we're going today. I'm going to tell you a little more about Metro West CD and the work that we do. Then I'm going to talk a bit about how affordable housing happens. And then I'm going to highlight 2 recent projects where we worked closely with local housing trusts to execute on the town's vision for affordable housing. And then I'm going to bring it home with a few key takeaways from our experiences and what we've come to understand as being the secret sauce for producing housing. All right, can everybody see and hear me okay? Doing okay? Okay, great. All right, so first, just a little bit more about Metro West CD. So we are a 31-year-old regional 501c3 nonprofit organization. We were founded in Watertown and now have our offices in Newton. We have a couple of key certifications. You'll quickly learn that affordable housing is a world of acronyms. So my apologies for so many of them on this page, but we are a certified community development corporation, which means we are incorporated to provide programs, offer services, and engage in other activities that promote and support community development. And we are also a certified community housing development organization, or CHODO, which is a HUD designation for entities with a proven track record of housing production. And we serve the West Metro Home Consortium. Acronyms aside, we see ourselves as a trusted, mission-oriented, skilled, and collaborative partner to various stakeholders on all things affordable housing. Okay, so we currently have a 25-town primary target area in the West Metro region, and our efforts to promote affordable housing fall into 3 categories. We connect people to it by working with individuals and families in their search for affordable housing and/or efforts to keep the housing they have, including administering financial and emergency rental assistance. We advocate for housing by working with community leaders to create and implement programs and policies that support housing production. And we build it. We leverage public and private resources to create high quality, sustainable, permanently affordable housing. So today I'm going to be highlighting our experience in this 3rd area of building affordable housing. Okay, so how does affordable housing happen? There are many steps, but it really starts with motivation. So I imagine you are all here today because you are in some way motivated to build housing. So that's a really great and critically important first step. Next up is an idea. So maybe some of you have ideas right now, or maybe our conversation today will help spark a few. Next up is feasibility, and there are 3 main considerations from our perspective. Is there a permitting path? Is there funding? And is there political will? And we will talk more about all of those things in a few minutes. And then after feasibility comes site control, which can come in a few different forms, which we will also talk more about. Then a project moves into design, permitting, and financing. And if all goes well, construction and lease up. And then we can celebrate and begin again. So it's a complex process and it takes time. So I would encourage you to be patient, but to get started and try to keep things moving each day. So you're probably thinking, that's great, but how do affordable housing trusts fit in and what can they do to help? All right, so I'm going to use the development process framework to walk through 2 recent examples of Metro West CD projects where affordable housing trusts played a key role in taking a vision to reality and producing housing. So in lovely Medway, Massachusetts, in terms of motivation, the Affordable Housing Trust and one select board member in particular saw a need to provide truly affordable housing affordable housing for families and seniors in town. The town also had a desire to play defense on 40B and maintain compliance with the 10% requirement. So next comes the idea. Medway did not have town-owned sites available for housing. So they reached out to Metro West CD and we spent some time scouting for property with the trust and the select board for market acquisition opportunities. And it was actually someone in the town planning department who said, hey, there's a site over on West Street. Maybe that could be a good option. It turned out that it was. So in terms of feasibility, the town hired outside counsel to advise and assist with the process. This was really key. It's complex work and you'll really want an expert to help who can advise the trust as projects move forward. So the key ingredients were in place here. We had a clear permitting path. The Affordable Trust had money in the bank and there was political will. So next comes site control. The Medway Affordable Housing Trust provided funds for the acquisition of the property. And having the funds in the bank allowed the trust to be responsive when opportunities popped up and allowed us to move pretty quickly, which was a great benefit to the project. In terms of design, permitting, and financing, the Affordable Housing Trust provided funding during pre-development and provided a lot of support during permitting. Additional parcels became available adjacent to the ones that we had purchased, and the town said, we love this idea, we love this project, let's double it. And so they did. And we ended up with a 92-unit intergenerational campus. So there were many things that came together to make the project a success. But the thing that stands out for me in Medway is just the unwavering political leadership from the trust and the select board from the very beginning of the process. So I am delighted to say that these efforts resulted in Glen Brook Way, which is a 92-unit, 2-phase, 100% affordable intergenerational campus. Phase 1, which is 48 units of family rental, was completed in December 2022. And phase 2, which is 44 units of senior rental, is now under construction, and we are expecting to complete construction by the end of this year. Okay, so that brings us to the other project that I wanted to highlight with all of you today in lovely Hudson, Massachusetts. So Hudson was a slightly different situation, but had many of the same ingredients as Medway in terms of what made the project successful. All right, so in terms of motivation, the Affordable Housing Trust and one select board member in particular saw a need to provide truly affordable housing in a gentrifying community. They also had CPA funds in the bank. And they knew that the updated census numbers were coming and that there was a chance that the town might fall below 10%. So next up is the idea. The town started to look at their properties and identified vacant and deteriorating municipal buildings. There was a desire to take these properties off of the town books and also eliminate eyesores and what they thought were eyesores in the community. And one site in particular was a great location for housing. And you can see it in the image here. It was a vacant police station on Packard Street. So next up is feasibility. The town received a technical assistance grant to fund a feasibility study, a community engagement process, and eventually an RFP process. The community engagement process was really key here. The site is surrounded by single-family homes, and the neighbors were able to participate in a meaningful process that ultimately led to them saying, "Yes, please, in my backyard." So at that point, there was a permitting path, there was money in the bank, and political will. So moving on to site control, this was a town-owned site, so the Affordable Housing Trust worked with a consultant to design and execute a competitive RFP process. I will just say that RFP processes are complex, and there are many ways that can go wrong. So I can't recommend strongly enough to get technical assistance from the lovely folks at MHP or elsewhere to ensure an effective process. Ultimately, 6 developers responded to the request for proposals, and Metro West CD's proposal was selected as the most advantageous. In terms of design, permitting, and financing, we had laid out our preliminary plans in the RFP response, and once we were selected, we worked closely with the town to advance design, permitting, and financing. So many things came together to make the project possible, but what stands out to me in Hudson included having a very strong local affordable housing trust, political leadership, a great site, CPA funds, and also a great planning department. I want to give a special shout out to any folks from planning departments who are on the call today. You play a key role in the process and ensure that the developer can keep the project moving while meeting the goals of the town. And we've had the great fortune to work with fantastic planning departments, some small, some large, and many towns, including Medway, Hudson, and Newton. Okay, so I am very happy to say, because of all of the efforts of the Affordable Housing Trust, we are creating 40 units of 100% truly affordable family rental homes available to households earning up to 60% of area median income. And the big news is that we officially started construction on this project just 2 weeks ago. So we are really excited to be underway. And the eyesore, the town has been very keen on having the police station demolished. And just this morning, it has been officially demolished. So folks are excited for the progress. Okay, so that brings us to the secret sauce. So here are some of the key ingredients for getting housing production done. Goals are very important, consensus on who and how to help. In terms of financing, having money in the bank and looking at reduced fees. For projects, building for permit fees can be very, very expensive. So that might be an area where towns might have some ability to assist projects. And also, if you can, making land or properties available. Planning grants and technical assistance with consensus building, site feasibility, and RFP development and issuance helps ensure an effective process. Town staff, again, they can serve as a key liaison between the developer and the town. And then a sense of trust and partnership. So this work really takes a village. And it's important to think about, and this might be a little bit of a shift in mindset, but thinking of the developer as a partner and the effort in executing your vision. Whoops. Okay. Also endurance. It's a marathon. This work takes time. So hang in there and go ahead and get started. And political will and leadership is always very, very important. But again, you know, a strong affordable housing trust really plays a central role in all of this work. So that might seem like a long list, but please don't despair. You are taking a critically important step by being here. So you've clearly got number one, motivation. And in terms of number two, an idea, maybe you have one, or maybe this presentation helped spark one. But in closing, I urge you to keep going, keep learning, and just imagine yourself here.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much, Caitlin. And we do have some questions.
Sure.
First, I would ask, since you were kind of ending on how long it takes, how long from start to finish did it take in, as well as you know, in Medway and Hudson?
Sure. So the town really started, let's see, it can take about 5 or 6 years. So, and this is changing. So oftentimes, funding cycles can be one of the determining factors in how quickly a project can get funded after a lot of the groundwork is done and you start to apply for your funding. But we are lucky to live in a state where there is a real focus on affordable housing production, and in many cases, funding available to make it happen. So in both our recent projects, Hudson and Newton, we were able to get funding for our projects very quickly. Sometimes you can wait 2 years to get a funding award. But because we had such strong local commitment and support, we were able to expedite the funding timeline. But, you know, I think we are going to be wrapping up at the end of 2023 on phase 2 in Medway. And I think their efforts, you know, started back as early as 2017. So it takes time.
Mm-hmm. And when you talk about different funding sources, about how many funding sources did you have to piece together for these two developments?
It usually takes about 11 different funding sources.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and what percentage is the local contribution typically out of total development costs?
Right. So it's the local contribution can, you know, seem like a significant contribution at the local level, but typically our projects, we use that local contribution to leverage public financing. So we typically end up in the local financing providing about 2% of the overall funding sources for our projects, because our projects can be, you know, $25 to $30 million, but that, you know, we are able to secure low-income housing tax credits, soft debt from the state, permanent mortgage, you know, assemble all of these many, many different sources of funding to help leverage that local contribution.
And so I don't want to get too much in the weeds with this, but there are some questions around it that just so that folks know that the responsibility for financing this falls on the developer to piece it together. But that Caitlin brought up that the local contribution is then used to show local support of the development, and that helps leverage the state and federal funds. The developer has to apply for a one-stop grant with the state, and so they're applying for all these resources on the state and federal level together. And that's not something that the trust is involved in. It has to be involved in engagement. That's really on the developer to piece that together. Is there anything else that you would add to that, Caitlin, to help explain kind of the process?
That's right. Yes, and I think, each of the funding sources has the one-stop process captures a number of the sources, but there are many different application processes and timelines. So it really helps to work with an experienced developer who has been through the process before, who knows the timelines, who has relationships with the various lending agencies to be able to move things forward. But yes, the local contribution is absolutely critical, certainly in the eyes of the state as kind of a first step in a project, but helps us leverage all of those other resources.
And so then when do you need the local allocation in the process? When?
Earlier is best. So oftentimes the local funds can be used for an acquisition. So having those funds available so that they can be used quickly is a big benefit. If some great opportunity arises, it allows a trust to be able to react quickly. And by the time we apply for state funding, the state will expect that the municipality has made a funding commitment to the project. So it needs to happen, early in the process. So I would encourage folks to try to, build your trust funds, create a trust, build up those funds, have them ready to go if an opportunity arises, because that is a pretty early stage step for us to be able to move forward.
So in the case of Medway, you wanted to acquire a private site and you used trust funds to do that, but Metro West was the one that actually purchased it, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
It was you, the developer.
That's correct. Right. So the trust contributed funds towards the acquisition, but the Metro West CD was the entity that took ownership of the site, maintained the site until the closing, and we are the long-term owner as well.
And with these units that you've built, can you talk about the ownership structure and who maintains them, who's income qualifying tenants, and some of that?
Sure. So Metro West CD, in the examples that we've talked about in all of our projects to date, we become the owner of the site, and we hire third-party property management to maintain the sites appropriately. It's very important to us to have high-quality communities when we are building in the communities that we serve. The property generates income that can support the payment of that maintenance. So towns are, no longer paying for the upkeep of sites that might have been previously town-owned, and the sites are self-sustaining after we, start construction and are in operations.
So I just wanted to say to everyone that this is the typical model where it's not the trust or the town that's owning it or doing any maintenance. It's that the trust is contributing a very small amount of the total development cost to help the developer access other resources and put a deal together, build it, own it, and manage it over the long term. So the community has an interest in that there would be, in these developments that Caitlin's bringing up, there's long-term affordability restrictions. And so that's a interest of the local community. And if you're putting in local funds, then you want to have an agreement to that end to be outlining those requirements. But the trust and the community is not maintaining it. It's the developer that's responsible for the development and then the management, the long-term management. One question, do you know off the top of your head, the total cost per unit with each of these developments?
Yes, so
or a general sense of what you're seeing in your developments?
typically I mean, it's becoming a challenging market, right? There's rising interest rates, construction costs are a challenge. We have had our most recent developments have been in the, about 40 unit range.
Good night, Tom.
And, we're looking anywhere from the upper $400,000 per unit up to the low $600,000 per unit, depending on the specific conditions at the site.
So Emma, I've been trying to follow the questions, but can you help me out here? Do you see others that are jumping out?
Let me look as well.
Oh, so one person in Tingsboro, Eric, is asking about your catchment area. He perhaps missed the slide at the beginning. Do you want to just reference again your particular catchment area?
Sure. So we currently have a 25 town target area that expands from Brookline and Newton up out to Harvard and then to Medway and kind of everything in between. So that is our current target area. But always, feel free to reach out to me. I might know of other CDCs that serve your area, but I'm happy to direct you and talk with you about any opportunities that you might be considering. So.
Okay. There's one question about can trusts issue loans? And I don't know if you've experienced that, but we do have some trusts where they structure, oftentimes it's structured as soft debt where it's potentially forgivable, but there are some trusts where they do expect to be paid back, at least in some cases. I'm wondering if you have any experience with that, Caitlin.
So our trust fund contributions so far have been structured as grants. Once you start to introduce, loans with interest rates, that starts to impact the overall financing structure and can increase debt service requirements, which reduces the permanent loan that the project can support and can reduce the other sources available. So it does have many ripple effects on the overall financing structure. And, if towns have funds available that have been made available expressly for the purpose of supporting housing, affordable housing, one of the best ways that you can do that is, by structuring it as a grant. It has many financial benefits to the project and ultimately leads to a better outcome and a more financially feasible proposal. So
Both these developments used low-income housing tax credits, correct?
that's correct. Yes.
You also receive state.
I'm sorry.
You also receive state low-income housing tax credits? Yep.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
There was a note here too that I think is helpful to point out. Someone noting that, Caitlin, you pointed out again that affordable housing trusts can act quickly and that they had a LIHTC development that was hit hard by COVID inflation and the trust was able to contribute quickly to help meet a shortfall. So another example of trust being really helpful with kind of moving projects forward when the financial pieces are shifting around.
Great. So just given the time, I'm gonna wrap this section up. I'm sorry if we didn't quite get to your question. Caitlin, thank you so much for being here and for sharing with your experiences. There's such great developments. They look amazing. And we just appreciate your sharing from your expertise. I'm gonna switch gears and ask my colleague, Katie Lacey, to have a bit of a conversation with me about how zoning can support affordable housing development. Thank you, Caitlin.
Hello, everyone.
So Emma's gonna find Katie and pin her. So great. Hi, Katie.
Hello.
This is my colleague at MHP, our colleague, Katie Lacey, and she is a planner and she is, well, do you want to say a little bit about yourself, Katie?
My title here is Senior Planner. There's other planners here at MHP.
I'm working a lot now on the MBTA Communities Act. I work with 40B projects that come into the agency and just generally help communities think about their zoning and how to use it to maybe increase affordable housing and also just housing in general, more diverse forms of housing.
So just really basic, and you don't have to get too far in the weeds, but just overall, what is zoning and why do communities use it?
So in Massachusetts, Chapter 40A authorizes city and towns to have zoning bylaws or ordinances if they're cities that, you know, at its nugget, it divides communities into districts and regulates the uses and intensity of uses. And that, so that would, intensity means height, setbacks, etc., of those uses. So that's it in a nutshell. Uses and how big they are.
And how do you see zoning as being able to support the creation of affordable housing?
Well, I mean, we've talked about this a lot in terms of big A, affordable housing, which is affordable housing that is subject to deed restrictions, income restrictions, you know, only certain rent limits, eligible for the SHI. There really aren't a lot of tools through zoning, I'm afraid. Inclusionary zoning is a very popular one in Massachusetts. We have lots and lots of communities that have some form of inclusionary zoning. And inclusionary zoning, if you're not familiar with that term, is where you're basically shifting the obligation to provide affordable units to the developer. And so any development that got built, or maybe it's limited to a certain district or type of development, you would say, okay, this percentage of it has to be affordable, meaning eligible for the SHI, technically. You can do different stuff. That's really the primary tool we have through zoning. Those units are regulated to a certain extent by the department. It's now Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities through the local initiative program as local action units. So they get on the SHI, the subsidized housing inventory, through that way. But ultimately, the local action is the town deciding to adopt inclusionary zoning. And I could go on and on about inclusionary zoning. Just, you know, beware, it's a tough game in terms of feasibility. It all depends on how hot the market you're in is. And, you know, so a community like Boston or Cambridge can require 20%. A smaller community is really safer around 10 to 15%. So we can answer questions if they come up about inclusionary zoning, but that's the primary zoning tool for affordable housing.
What is the process in Massachusetts to change zoning on the local level?
Well, it's all written in the Zoning Act, and the planning board, the select board, the zoning board of appeals, or 10 authorized signatories, so this is in towns, not cities, can propose a zoning article. There's a pretty elaborate process to getting it to, say, a town meeting form a vote, but that it has to originate with one of those boards. So oftentimes I've worked with trusts or wonderful housing advocates, and they're like, we want to do a zoning article. They really need to partner with one of those, the planning board or the board of selectmen, to advance that. Or it won't go through the correct process. And then once that happens, there's a very big lead up in terms of public notice and hearings and a planning board hearing. So it's complicated. You'd be better off working with town staff to help you through that process if that's of interest to you.
Thank you. So you brought up the MBTA zoning 3A, and it doesn't specifically require an affordability. It's really about allowing greater density but it doesn't specifically require that it be affordable housing. Can you just speak a little bit to why allowing multifamily housing in some of parts of our community can help to support affordable housing in itself?
Yeah, the second part of what I didn't say before is that's big A affordable housing would be inclusionary and maybe even 40R, which is a whole nother topic. But just in terms of diversity of housing, maybe smaller housing, tools like allowing multifamily by right, allowing smaller buildings to be built, allowing a diversity of housing. The sense is at this point, we're really at a supply and demand crisis in Massachusetts. It's not going to happen overnight, but that by increasing the supply of housing, the cost will come down. I'm not an economist, but that's the premise of it. The MBTA Zoning Act explicitly talks about by right multifamily housing, meaning no special permits, no special requirements. And implicit in that is no requirement for affordability. So it's not just not, I mean, at its heart, it's a production law. It's not an affordable housing law. The state in its wisdom said, given that we have this 40B 10% requirement, we're going to consider requests of up to 10% affordable to be as of right. So in other words, they kind of just look their other way about that. So I'm probably wandering from your question, but that's, the whole idea behind the MBTA Zoning Act is that one, it's environmentally a good idea for communities to encourage as much housing as possible near transit if they have it, and if not near mixed use areas, because we really are going to have to change our lifestyles and start walking to things. It's a change, but look at the weather, it's changing. So and it really only affects a small amount of each community, and it leaves it up to the community to develop the zoning that they want. It just has to be a certain density and in certain locations. So
I'm wondering, for communities that aren't bound by the MBTA zoning at this point, so they're not having to go through a lot, they're not being required by the state to go through a lot of the planning that many communities are doing right now. Do you have suggestions for these communities that some of the folks on the call, they may want to see changes with zoning, maybe not sure where to start? Do you have any kind of tips?
Yeah, I mean, I think if any of you or communities have explored the housing choice criteria, there's some, I'd say, well-tested best practices for zoning that allow for a diversity of housing and allow for less affordable housing, less expensive housing to be built. People often complain that those starter homes that people used to build, why doesn't anyone build them? And right now, it starts with lot size. Since the 70s, minimum lot sizes have increased. You've probably seen that graphic with the football field with a single house, so that there's many acre lots, 2-acre lots, half-acre lots. And back in the 50s and 60s, there were many quarter-acre lots and smaller. Reduced land area brings the cost of the house down and allows you to build a smaller house and not make that enormous profit. So that's one, reducing lot sizes. I think keep staying open to an additional story or two on a building. I think so many communities limit it at 2 or 2.5 stories. 3 or 4 is just not that big. It got very dark in here. I'm not sure what happened. Hold on. Am I still in the dark? A little better.
You're being too still.
So just in general, being flexible about dimensions. I know we want everything to look nice in our community, but that comes at a cost, a big cost. So a little higher, maybe a little closer together, the way we used to build things. I'm sure Shelley has pointed this out, but many of the neighborhoods we love the most in our older towns are non-conforming at the moment. So maybe looking back, seeing what's on the ground. Some communities are going with form-based zoning. Then there's, allowing accessory dwelling units is really helpful. And more communities are doing that. Allows people to stay in their homes maybe and get some extra income, allows single people and couples to move into the community. So it's all about housing diversity. So there's a toolbox of those things.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if anyone has a zoning question you'd like to ask Katie. And you can actually just unmute yourself if you'd like. Nope, I don't see any in the chat. So thank you so much, Katie, for taking.
Oh, sure.
Zoning for us. Just one of the, I'm sorry, Cynthia, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, can she just speak a minute about friendly 40Bs? I mean, is that a zoning issue?
That is such a great point. Technically, 40B is not zoning. It's outside of zoning, but I'm so glad you mentioned friendly 40Bs. Those are 40Bs permitted through the local initiative program, and they require that a community endorse the project before the process even gets started. So it's more of a partnership. So they call them LIP 40Bs, local initiative 40Bs, or friendly 40Bs. It's a tremendous tool, and it was actually rolled out specifically to get, to provide communities a tool that they could use 40B to their advantage. Because right now the way it allows people that want mixed use housing or multifamily housing in their community to get it, even if their zoning doesn't allow it. And 40B, keep in mind, LIP and non-40B, it's the single biggest producer of multifamily housing in the state, has been for decades. We just aren't building it any other way. So if a community can partner with a developer to get a diversity of housing, it's such a great idea.
Thank you. Any other questions? There's one about a zoning housing diversity list. You didn't bring up that, did you? I think that.
I was saying that when you apply to become a housing choice community, they have a list of best practices in zoning, and I can't recite it to you verbatim, but it's in that application, and it's everything we just talked about: multifamily by right, accessory dwelling units. I think they should include, and we're open to LIP applications and friendly 40Bs, but it doesn't. So that's where that would be.
So I think that
I saw a question about 40S. I'm going to pass on that one. I know almost nothing about it.
And so I think in terms of housing choice, if you just Google mass housing choice, you'll probably get the state website to direct you to that.
Yeah.
Towns with zoning examples for congregated, like co-housing bylaw. Do you see the one with towns with zoning examples for congregated co-housing bylaws?
I can't hear you.
It's just that in the chat, the towns with zoning examples for congregated, like co-housing bylaws, is that zoning or is that just a bylaw? Would that be considered zoning?
Well, there are cluster developments that can be arranged through zoning, a permitted use through zoning. Co-housing is a form of ownership that would be outside of zoning. I think that's what they meant by co-housing. Like, I know in Amherst, there's several successful examples where it's sort of, it's almost like a condominium form of ownership with a different form of they share the land and stuff.
Got it. So I think that we're going to wrap up this, and I thank you so much, Katie, for being here and for sharing some.
I did just want to say one thing, which is that there's a lot of talk, MBTA communities and everything, about as of right zoning, and I did want to clarify what that is, because as of right means if you meet all the criteria in the zoning bylaw, you get to build it. Most multifamily residential in Massachusetts requires what's called a special permit, which is, it's in there so that the town can make the development look good, but it does add often a level of discretion that can be very unpredictable and discouraging to a developer. So that's the difference between special permits and by right. So go by right. That's the idea. Thanks, Shelley.
Thank you so much, Katie. I appreciate it.
Yep.
So Emma is gonna just wrap us up by sharing about MHP's technical assistance program to support the disposition of municipal and housing authority land for affordable housing. So Emma is gonna pull that up. Some information about that.
Let me share my screen. Make sure I share the right thing. Is that showing up as full screen, Shelley?
Yes.
Awesome. So I just wanted to give a quick highlight to MHP's pre-development technical assistance. Caitlin mentioned kind of the tricky pieces that can come into play when putting together an RFP. So we are here as a support for municipalities as well as housing authorities for the process leading up to an RFP and including the RFP. So some direct assistance, grants for third-party technical assistance, which can include assessing the site and financial feasibility, and then helping to prepare those RFPs. And those requests would go through Laura Schufelt, who is also part of our community or oversees the community assistance team here at MHP. So just a quick plug there. If you have any questions, please reach out to Laura. And wanted to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our presenters who gave such helpful information. That was really very thorough and insightful. And thank you to all of you for such thoughtful questions. That was very engaging in the chat, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us and share your thoughts and ask questions. I hope you learned something to take with you. I will be posting the recording and the slides on Toolbox. I'll send it out to everyone who registered so you can share it if there's anyone who is curious or missed it and couldn't come. It will be available for you to share and watch again. And any follow-up questions, please send them off to Shelley. Is there anything you missed?
Nope, sounds good. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
All right, take care, everyone.